Lowrider.
Okay, there we go. I just want to say thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. This was a great honor to be here with Will. He's a fellow Texan, so you know we have secret handshakes. Even though he's an Aggie and I'm a Red Raider, but we won't hold that against each other. But we're very happy that he's here tonight to discuss his book. If you haven't read it, you must. I've spent the last week going through it. It made me very happy in that the stories you tell are in places where I played football and ran track meets out in West Texas where nobody else in the world knows. Little places.
You guys say West Texas, not Pakistan or Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, West Texas. And so, yeah, there are places that he and I are probably the only people in the room, places like Presidio and Sanderson that we've ever visited. But I guess the starting point here is, why'd you write it?
Look, I wrote the book. The idea, somebody asked me, have you ever thought about writing a book? I said no. And they're like, well, if you were going to write a book, what would it be about? And I said it would be about the things that I thought we should have been talking about in Congress that we weren't. And so ultimately it's all organized by what I consider to be 5 generational defining challenges that the country is faced with. But then I said, okay, nobody wants to read some policy book, right? And I'm like, but how did I come to these conclusions? And I started thinking, you know, on each one of these issues, there's 5, 6 experiences that I had, whether it was, you know, recruiting spies and stealing secrets in the CIA, or, you know, fighting over legislation in the halls of Congress, or things I learned, you know, protecting private sector businesses against nation-state actors in the public sector, in the private sector, excuse me. And so I said, okay, let's start with those issues. Like, in a good example, when I thought about China and the Chinese government, let me be clear: Chinese government. When I say if I say China, I mean the Chinese government. The beef is with the Chinese government, not the Chinese people. Definitely not Chinese Americans. What our Asian American brothers and sisters have been dealing with the last couple of years is just unacceptable. The kind of hate crime that's been focused on them. So, Chinese government. When I left the CIA in 2009, I did not consider China to be, I said, okay, maybe a near peer. I didn't think they were anywhere close to being a peer of the United States. And I chased Chinese intelligence officers all over the world. And that was old-fashioned thinking in '09. And then I thought, okay, how did my opinion on China change? It changes from 5 or 6 different examples. And so when I thought, why not share those stories? That's kind of how the idea of the book came about. Because ultimately, this is about, we're at a moment in time where politically, culturally, historically, where it's impossible to get big things done in the United States. And we can't continue this way. And I start the book with the second lesson I learned at what I used to call the super secret CIA training facility, the farm. Now it's on Google Maps. I wish that was a joke. It really is on Google Maps. And the second lesson you learn is get off the X. The X is the location where something's going down, and the last place you want to be where it's going down is where it's going down. Right? We're at a moment in time that we got to do something different. And guess what? 72% of Americans agree. 72% of Americans think the country's on the wrong track. And that is an issue, and that's a feeling that has been growing over the years. And we got to do something different. We got to do something better. We got to get off the X. And that's why I wrote American Reboot.
Wonderful. I guess one of my favorite fundamental questions is, who are your role models? Who are the ones that help create this sort of intellectual, because I read this as an intellectual biography in many ways. Who are those people? You know, you and I talked earlier about people like Joe Strauss. We both know Texas political culture quite well. He's a former Speaker of the House in Texas. And I think you see divisions in Texas, for example, between the Joe Strausses of the world and Louis Gohmert and Dan Patrick and on the other side. So who are the people who have fundamentally shaped your sort of worldview, including just your political views?
Well, it starts with my mom and dad, right? My dad's black, my mom's white. My dad's from East Texas. My mom's from Indiana, and they met in L.A. Right? They met in L.A. in the late '60s, got married, and they moved to South Texas in 1971. It was not in vogue to be an interracial couple in South Texas. Right? 1971 is 4 years after the Loving versus United States court case, which made it legal to be an interracial couple. It wasn't that long ago. And so my parents, it starts with my parents and seeing their love for each other, and that was a great example. My dad always taught me to have a PMA, a positive mental attitude. This is a dude that he was a traveling salesman, and he would be in stores in the 60s, 70s, and they'd be like, get out of here, and call him the N-word. But he had to do his job, and he would figure out ways in order to start selling their wares. At the end of the interaction, the person's hugging them, being like, when you coming back, right? And so the stuff my father had to deal with, my mom, my parents live in the home that right now they've been in for 50 years, because it was the only place in San Antonio, Texas that would sell to an interracial couple. My dad was a traveling salesman, and he'd be on the road during the week. My mom would go house hunting, and then they're like, I gotta show it to my husband, he'll be back, and they'd come up Friday or Saturday. And my dad would show up, and they're like, sorry, we sold this house, right? And so it starts with those are the folks that I learned from. I was also lucky, I'm the baby of three. I affectionately refer to my brother as my idiot big brother. My brother, I learned from his mistakes, and I learned from my sister's successes, right? And so I had them. But then I was lucky when I went to Texas A&M University so my degree was in computer science, and I thought I was going to be a coder, right? I was going to be a software developer, and I had never really been outside of Texas. I see a sign my freshman year on campus, take 2 journalism classes in Mexico City for $425. I had $450 in my bank account, and I went to Mexico. Fell in love being in another culture. It was cool reading about things I'd only seen in books. Added internationally as a minor. First guest lecturer, the CIA tough guy that told these most amazing stories. And I was like, I want to do that. And then I was lucky that George H.W. Bush, President Bush, his school got started at A&M the year I was there. And when he learned I was interested in the CIA, he's like, have you met Bobby Gates? And Dr. Bob Gates, the former head of the CIA, former Secretary of Defense, these were the people that influenced me. George W. Bush, when he was governor, was at A&M a lot. And he was such a gregarious, I'm 19, 20 years old, and I'm seeing this guy as a governor slapping people on the back, spoke really good Spanish, real cool dude. Like, these were some of the people that I was lucky to be influenced by at a young age, and taught me about, public service, taught me about serving something larger than yourself. And so I was lucky to have some amazing people like that.
Yeah, it's obvious. I mean, I didn't tell you this, but George W. was the speaker at my high school commencement.
Sure.
So we have some overlap even there. But you can see this in your writings. This is a very different, I see the influence of the Bushes. I see the influence of people like Director Gates. And I think that's extremely important for understanding where you're coming at this from, and that the great opportunities they provided you. Well, let me I'm going to spend most of the time talking about foreign policy issues, because that's what we are as a group. We could go, like I say, we could discuss political culture and what's going on in our country right now, and the policy side of it in terms of many different issues. But I think focusing on foreign policy will be. And before I forget, I'm seeing Sydney walk around. If you do have questions, underneath you are the blue cards that you can put your questions on, and we'll bring them forward, okay? But let's go here. I love your title chapters. you know, the first one that was, that stood out to me is, I'm sorry, enemies should fear us, friends should love us. What do you mean with that?
I've been associated with the national security community for over 2 decades, and I learned something simple. Your friends should love you and your enemies should fear you. What does that mean? And let's use Ukraine as an example. President Zelensky is asking us to do more. Yes, you know, the West has provided a lot of weapons, but he's saying we need more, and it's not enough. And that's an example of your friends aren't really in love with you because they need you to do more. Then you have Vladimir Putin, an adversary, an enemy, it's very clear, who is unafraid of increasing the amount of death and destruction that he is putting on the Ukrainian people, because he's not afraid of what the response of the West is going to be, and primarily the United States. And so for me, it is about making sure that you have your friends back. And there's this notion that America should be isolationist. George Washington was probably right when he gave his farewell address about don't get involved in entangling alliances. The world is a very different place. It's super interconnected. And if we're going to deal and be successful in what I consider to be the most important challenge to our society, and this is this new Cold War with the Chinese government, the only way we're going to be able to deal with the Chinese government is if we have more friends. And America has been at our best when we are using our soft and our hard power to make sure this international system that we helped build after World War II is functioning properly. And we have to remember, when you say Cold War, everybody thinks obviously the U.S. and the Soviets. The difference is the Soviet economy and the Russian economy has never been anywhere near the size of the American economy. The Soviet culture and American culture and Russian culture has never been as intertwined as we are with China. In the Cold War with us and Russia, if the United States is a basketball, Russia was a baseball. That's flipped when it comes to the Chinese government. Their economy is, some economists think it's already bigger than ours now. Their population is bigger than ours, right? And there's a level of interconnectedness. And so if we're going to be able to compete, we have to have a big posse. And that requires us to make sure your friends love you. Now, it also means we got to know who our friends are and who our enemies are. And I can make cases all the way back to probably Bill Clinton, of where presidents and administrations have gotten that wrong, where they've treated their friends like enemies and their enemies like friends. I hope no other president tries to restart relations with Vladimir Putin. Every president tries to do it. It's not going to work, right? And so that's what I mean by this concept, and it seems pretty basic, but we should be looking at all of our interactions through that lens and making sure our friends love us and our enemies fear us.
Okay, let me follow up with that. If you were sitting in the White House right now, how would you be responding in the Ukraine? I mean, once the genie was out of the bottle with the invasion,
Sure.
What would be your policy prescriptions right now?
So the day after, the day after the invasion, I put out a piece that basically said, that was supportive of what General Breedlove, our former U.S. Commander at NATO, talked about a humanitarian no-fly zone. And I said we should be giving as much equipment to people. And my old chief of staff calls me. He's like, Will, man, you're like way out there on this. The public's not there. And they weren't. It's true. But it was the right thing to do. We should be giving every heavy weapon that the Ukrainians can absorb. And we should have been doing it yesterday. Now, everyone wants to talk about escalation. If you do that, it's going to escalate the conflict. Well, in 2015, in late 2014, when the Russians invaded Ukraine the first time, And there was talk about javelins. It was like, oh, we shouldn't give javelins to the Ukrainians because that's going to cause the Russians to escalate. Even back in December of this year when we were talking about sanction, oh, don't put sanctions on the Russians because that's going to cause them to escalate. Well, they went in anyways. And so trying to expect that we know what the second, third, fourth, and fifth order of effects of how Vladimir Putin's going to respond, we're not going to be able to figure that out. So start with first principles. Prevent the unnecessary massacre of innocent people. So give them every piece of heavy weapon. We don't need boots on the ground. We're stopped short of that. And give them every weapon so they can defend themselves. That includes the MiGs. And we're starting to see a little bit of movement on these issues. Because guess what? Putin's already having a hard time in Ukraine. So does he want Poland to get involved? Which is a bigger military, more professional military. Does he want to see French fighter jets flying over Ukraine? Absolutely not. Oh, and by the way, yes, is it within the Russian military doctrine to loose one nuclear missile? It is. They call it escalate to de-escalate, where if they're losing, they launch a nuclear missile to try to get everybody to calm down. But in every war game in the last 35 years, escalate does not lead to de-escalation. It leads to mutual assured destruction. And so Putin knows that, and he knows that if he were to lose even one nuclear weapon, the rest of the world would completely abandon him, including China. If you look at the number of countries that have not supported Western sanctions on Russia, it's pretty significant. Of 190 countries in the UN, 140 haven't supported sanctions. If Russia used a nuclear weapon, all that's over. You're going to get 109. You're going to get 188. Syria, North Korea, probably the only ones that don't join, and you're going to see China come to us. So that is what I would be doing. Oh, and by the way, instead of trying to negotiate another Iran deal, which is significantly flawed, at a time when we're going to upset our Sunni Arab partners who are influential in dealing with a energy crisis, a growing energy crisis, I would be spending time in using my diplomatic time in Central and South America in the Western Hemisphere to make sure all those countries are backing us when it comes to dealing with Russia. That's how I would be spending time, energy, and effort on these, and then making a continued case of why Ukraine matters. We have fallen down on the people that care about this. Is why it's always great to come and talk to groups like y'all, because you care about these issues. Putin went in because of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I'm sure we can get into this. I hate that phrase, forever war. It's offensive to me. And Putin saw that and said, hey, the American public doesn't even have appetite for Afghanistan. They're not going to have an appetite for Ukraine. And then what happens in Ukraine is going to determine what happens in Taiwan. China's going to invade Taiwan, period, full stop. And if you think supply chain issues are bad now, wait until the Chinese government owns 70% of semiconductor manufacturing, which is the building block of every piece of technology, whether it's your fancy phone, your fancy car, or your refrigerator. So if you think supply chain is bad now and prices are bad now, wait until that happens. So those are the things I would do.
Right. Let's take that to China, because one of the arguments I've been making is I think this sent a message to Xi that if you invade Taiwan, the repercussions are going to be significantly more than what you might have anticipated if you watched Putin in Crimea in 2014 versus what we're seeing now. What do you think about that? What lessons do you think the Chinese are taking from Putin's, first of all, military failures,
Sure.
and they're going to have significantly more challenging logistical problems trying to cross the straits? What do you think they're learning from this?
So they're reassessing a number of issues. Like, nobody thought that the Western alliance was as strong as it was. Nobody thought the response was going to be as quick and as swift. Now, the sanctions that are happening on Russia, the Russian economy is not as bad now as it was in 2008 when the ruble collapsed, right? And so So there's probably still some more pressure there. But the Chinese are evaluating these sanctions. The Russian economy was already pretty separate from everyone else. The Chinese economy is not. And while sanctions, and the Chinese government has to think, sanctions on China is going to impact everybody because they're so important in the supply chain. But who does it impact the most? And who can absorb that pain the longest? And that's a debate. The Russian people are probably the best in the world at absorbing drama and problems and toiling on. The Chinese government, their biggest fear is when you have almost 2 billion people, if they're not happy, if they're not feeling like they're getting the things that they need, that public opinion turns to public outrage, and then you're going to see a level of friction and problems in the country that they're not ready for. So these are all the things that she is having to deal with and think through. But they are not going to make the same mistakes militarily that the Russians did. They're more sophisticated. Their technology is significantly better, and they know that. And so, but when are they willing to deal with this? And look, there's a clock. The Chinese government is trying to become the sole superpower by 2049. That is 100 years of communist rule in the Middle Kingdom. This is not my opinion. This is not me coming up with this idea, laying in bed at night, thinking about what's happening. This is what the Chinese government has said about themselves. And so they know that clock is ticking, and they also have an opinion that if they do anything negative, the rest of the world will only, be upset with them for about, 15, 16 years? And why is that number 16? Tiananmen Square? 16 years later, what happened? Beijing Olympics. Right? And that's that time horizon. So they're thinking that all of these things are going into their plans. And if y'all haven't read American Reboot, and then read 2034 by Admiral Stavridis. It's his opinion on how, it's a fiction book, great read, but it talks about how World War III is going to start, and I think it's pretty accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what he's hoping to prevent, is by outlining that. So that's been an interesting aspect of that book. But I think the second thing that I think stood out to me is, and this is on page 153, you say, we take being a democracy for granted. Don't you see this sort of global struggle right now is between authoritarianism and democracy? And how do you see that continuing to play out?
So, people criticize President Biden for his speech in Poland when he said that it was democracies versus authoritarian governments. And they said that was too broad. I think it was the actual right framing. I remember after I got back from Mexico in college, and I took my first foreign affairs class, the first lesson in that first class was on the rule of law. And I'm like, 18-year-old Will Hurd's like, rule of law? Of course there's rule of law. Why are we having a whole class on rule of law? Why is this the first thing we're talking about? Of course there's rule of law. This is a dumb class. Until I lived places that didn't have rule of law. And then I went back, I was like, oh, now I see why they're talking about this. We assume that democracy, this is the only thing. Of course, democracy is going to continue. But democracy is fragile. Why do we call America an experiment? It's an experiment because when we started, nobody thought it was going to work. It wasn't until 60 years later that there was another democracy in the world, Switzerland. There are only 14 countries that have been a democracy for more than 100 years. This is the only form of government we know. And we think it's automatically going to exist. But all those principles and theories that make a democracy work, majority rule with minority rights, separation of powers, the ability to criticize your government, popularly elected officials, the power is centered in the individual, not the government, right? These were novel concepts. And the fact that we've been able to make it work, but it's fragile. And so we have to fight for this every single day. Freedom House, which is started after World War II, it has this freedom index. I think it's the last 14 years there's been a decline of democracies around the world. That's scary. The explosion, kind of the Cambrian explosion of democracies happened after the wall fell, the Berlin Wall fell, and then we're seeing almost an opposite. So that's scary. And so we have to get back to understanding why these principles matter. The older I get, the more I think about basic questions. What is the role of America in the rest of the world? What is a democracy? What are the things that underpin it? So yes, this is a broader struggle. And here's what happens. An authoritarian government can get somewhere first. And I think a lot of these debates come down to safety versus freedom. When people don't feel safe, they're willing to give a little bit of their freedoms up in order to feel safe. We saw that at the beginning of the pandemic. If y'all, my friends here, the soon-to-be national champs, y'all probably too young for this movie, The Siege, with Denzel Washington. It's a great movie that talks about this. When we are scared, we give up our freedoms, right? And so this is a constant struggle, and we are. And I'll be a little controversial. The fact that we're debating masks, that's a sign that we got it pretty good. If that's your biggest, whether a mask is a pain in the rear to wear or not, if that's your biggest concern, you're doing okay. And so we need to be thinking about these broader issues. Anyways, I hope that answered your question.
Well, no, I think that is this larger struggle. I actually just taught a course on how democracies die. And I started with Athens and came forward. And unfortunately, we seem to be teetering, especially in places like Nicaragua, Venezuela, ones that are closest to us. So I think that is a very good point to keep in mind.
To your point on this, okay, Hungary, perfect example. We're going to see other Eastern European countries go that way the longer the Ukrainian crisis continues. And let me rephrase that. As long as the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues. Why? These are governments in Eastern Europe are having to deal with a population that is living under the threat of war. The closer you are to Russia, the more impactful sanctions and secondary sanctions have on you and your daily life. And then you're dealing with a growing humanitarian crisis, the Ukrainian refugees going to those countries. Last month, Warsaw increased its population by 14% in a month. So the longer this crisis goes on, these governments are going to deal with the pressures of their population dealing with these factors. And then you're going to start seeing potentially them behaving a little more like Hungary. Because why? Their safety and security is being threatened.
Very much so.
And so not only should we, the United States and the West, be giving heavy weapons to the Ukrainians, we need to start thinking about the rebuild now. And the rebuild of Ukraine actually begins in Moldova, in Slovakia, in Poland. And so all of these things are interconnected, and we're seeing this trend of safety and security and freedom is going to be playing out in Eastern Europe.
Well, we're running a little short on time.
Sorry.
No.
Tighten up your answers, Will.
No. That was not an indication.
I'm joking.
We don't have enough time. You and I can sit here and go for this last one. I think is really important, and that is prepare for the wars of tomorrow, not the ones of the past. And given your expertise in cybersecurity, I think this is one. I mean, we're seeing what's going on the ground in Ukraine. You know, I'm not sure the U.S. is going to put as much money in tanks from this point forward, for example. But we're going to put it in drones and other things. But let's tie it to all that and how you see that. Prepare for that war of the future. What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. The future conflict is in the domain of cyberspace, right? We got some questions there. And so a lot of people say, hey, we haven't seen the Russians do as much cyber attacks in Ukraine that we all expected. No, they have. We've actually been prepared. And this is I think a good marks for CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, part of DHS that works on defending digital infrastructure. They were working back in November and December of last year, working with critical infrastructure providers, working with other governments, NSA, CIA, to say, hey, how do you make your digital infrastructure more resilient? Now, the book 2034, it starts with, Future Conflict starts with the White House not being able to use their phones. Being in a truly communication denied environment, would we be able to function? Would y'all be able to function with your families if you didn't have cell phone service for a week? How would you be able to coordinate? How would you be able to do things, right? And it's funny because, look, when you're in the CIA and you're going to meet someone that's giving you secrets, that's committing espionage, you don't just text them and be like, hey bro, I'll see you on the street corner at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? You have to, it is a process to be able to operate without using your phone. So can we operate in that kind of environment? Are we resilient enough? So Texas, we went through this problem last winter where our grid almost collapsed. You can mimic that with a cyber attack that would have potentially led to our grid being shut down. Here's the thing that I learned when I was, helping build a cybersecurity company. Everybody says, we would go in and you talk to all the senior people and the chief information security officer, you talk to the security officer, you talk to all of them, be like, what are you doing to protect your digital infrastructure? And you're like, oh, wow, you're doing that. Wow, this is like gold star. Okay, tomorrow we're gonna pop the hood. And then your hackers get in and 4 minutes in, you have complete control of their entire infrastructure because nobody actually does all the things that they say they're doing. And so that's what we ultimately have to prepare for. Now, but the other areas that we don't think of, space is contested. The amount of terrestrial activity that actually starts in space is really important. And what is the Chinese government doing? They're creating satellites that have a claw. There's only one reason you have a satellite with a claw. Because that claw is going to claw something. Our satellites, to knock them out in order to impact our ability to communicate here on Earth. The other area that I'm super concerned with is quantum computing. So the use of quantum physics to improve the power of a computer, it's just so significant. It is off the charts. We're never going to be able to get to that level of power with Moore's laws based on current traditional computers work. But what quantum computing is going to be able to do is going to be able to break every kind of encryption we have now. So the Chinese are probably ahead of us on this. So imagine, and they're already sucking up every bit of ciphertext, every communication they can that's encrypted they can't break because one day they're going to be able to break it. So we need to be moving towards, but we also know how to create encryption that's quantum resilient. Now, everybody except for this front row is going to remember Y2K. All right, for y'all. December,
Born that.
yeah, December 31, 1999. No computer had been prepared for the date to flip. It was going to go back, everyone's going to think it was going to go back to like BC times, basically. So I was a junior in high school, a junior in college, excuse me, and I was supposed to drive to see my girlfriend in Dallas from San Antonio. It's a 4-hour drive. I was freaking out. I was like, it's Y2K. I'm not going to drive on Y2K. Nothing happened on Y2K. Nothing. It was a non-event. Why? We spent $1 trillion in 4 years preparing to make sure the clocks on the computer worked after December 31st, 1999. That's the level of focus and initiative we have to have when it comes to quantum. But quantum is so complicated, it's like, you know, it's almost like a philosophical answer of how quantum computing works. And so those are the things that we have to be ready for. But instead, we're still thinking about, you know, how wars were fought in Afghanistan and places like, which we're going to have other conflicts like that. But we have to be able to do both, because that next conflict, the conflict in the South China Sea, is going to be the Chinese trying to deny and make sure none of the communications gear on our ships and our planes are going to be able to work. And if those ships can't connect with a satellite in the sky, will it be able to operate? And unfortunately, I don't know. I think the answer is maybe.
Yeah, and maybe's not a comfortable
That's not
answer.
comfortable. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I usually try not to end on a negative.
No.
Tone, but
I'm going to throw
we
you.
got some more questions.
Yeah,
so,
so let's go with some questions now. And I just want to say, the book answers a lot of the questions. Some of the questions that are coming to me have now already been answered, so I'm going to try to go through those as quick as possible. But I do think this is one that is tied fundamentally both to international and domestic, and that is, I'm sorry, I'm getting old, you can't see these things as well, especially when they're written in pencil. How does the United States bring back production and ownership of materials back to the United States so that it can compete on a global scale? And I know you addressed this in the book, but I'm going to throw you this one.
Sure. So it's not just about being produced back in the United States. It's got to be being produced. I think we should be thinking about North America. We're lucky to have Canada and Mexico as neighbors, and so we need to be thinking about North American competitiveness. We have forgotten why supply chains matter. Yes, we want to be able to create efficiencies and bring down costs, but when it comes to food, water, power, we should make sure that we're able to do some of this stuff ourselves. And we're seeing that now with the issue in Ukraine. We're seeing that with energy independence. Most people in this room never ever thought that America would become energy secure. Independence suggests that we don't import anything. I don't know if we're ever going to get to that point, but we're to the point where we're energy secure, and we could have been better. Oh, and by the way, you can be energy secure and address the environment at the same time. We're the ones best designed to be able to do that. Now the one issue, and this is probably the last, this is a bipartisan issue in Congress right now, is this whole thing about semiconductors. There's a bill that's likely to get passed pretty soon in the House, it's passed the House, passed the Senate. They're doing a thing called a conference where you got to make sure the House and the Senate version are the same. What it's going to do about $52 billion with a B in making sure that we're bringing semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. Great. That's going to take a while. It's going to take more than probably 5 years. If you listen to the Taiwanese government, they're like, China's going to invade no later than 2025. So are we going to be able to move that kind of production back to the United States quick enough? And do we have the talent to do that? Which is another reason why we need to be streamlining legal immigration. And I talk about immigration significantly in the books, the biggest chapter. We can address the crisis on our southern border, which is really a crisis, and streamline legal immigration at the same time, and address things like the Chinese government's going to steal our technology and our intellectual property. Let's steal their engineers. So if someone, if there's a Chinese student at your esteemed university and wants to come work in America, hey, here's your visa, right? We have benefited from the brain gain of every other country, and we should be able to continue that. And that is part of this cycle of making sure we're doing production here in the United States.
Well, and I think that takes us to this fundamental question I'm seeing recurrent in all the questions, and that is, how do we fix the problems in terms of the lack of bipartisanship? Although I'm by nature a hopeful optimist.
Sure.
And have seen, how we've rallied around the Ukraine. Yeah, there have been outliers, but I mean, if you look at the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership, there really has not been that much disagreement. What are some other areas outside of semiconductors? Because the immigration one is like the third rail of American politics now.
So what's crazy to me, and we'll start with immigration. I could tell you 5 things that we can do today that would address many of these problems, and 70% of Democratic primary voters would agree, and 70% of Republican primary voters would agree. However, both sides would rather use this as a political bludgeon against each other rather than solving the problem. And so the core issue, the structural problem that we have, is that you have elected officials talking and focusing on the extremes rather than the middle. The political continuum is no longer a line, it's a horseshoe. And the edges are closer to each other than they are the middle. And the reason you have elected officials talking to the extremes is because primaries decide so much. In the last non-presidential election, 34 seats in the House were decided in the general election. These were the contested seats, right? And competitive seats, excuse me. In a competitive, I define competitive as in the last presidential primary, the population voted for one party of president and the opposite party for their elected official, their House member. It's only 34 out of 435. That's 8%, which means 92% of House seats were decided in a primary when the average number of voters that voted was 54,000 people. That means 26,501 people are deciding 92% of the House seats. When I was student body president at Texas A&M, I got 17,000 votes, right? Like you're not that far away. So 2% of the population is deciding many of the people that are going to Washington to make these decisions. Now, that was in 2020. 2020 is 34 seats. You go to 2000, the number of competitive seats was north of 75. You go to 1980, north of 130. For the last 30 years, there's been this perception that the only way to get things done is when you have one party rule, where one party controls the White House, the House, and the Senate. It's actually the worst way to govern. Every bill that we know the name of, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the First Step Act, all of these pieces of legislation was passed when one party had control of the House and the other party had control of the Senate. That's how you create lasting legacies and legislation. But the last 30 years, we've been thinking of doing the opposite. And so that creates bomb throwers, not problem solvers. And then it creates elected officials who are interested in fear-mongering rather than inspiring, right? And that's what needs to change. And That means we need to be voting more. We need to be voting in primaries. We need more people to vote in primaries. We as individuals need to model the behavior that we want to see in our elected officials. If we think social media is toxic, are we contributing to that toxicity, or are we trying to behave a little bit differently? Right? We got to model the behavior that we want to see in our elected officials, and we got to take more of a role in getting involved in primaries.
Yeah, because I think you could add in there the two best opportunities in terms of immigration reform were the same basic concept, 65, 86. Simpson Mazzoli as a prime example. One was most successful, and two very different people were leading that charge. So I agree with you wholeheartedly there.
San Bernardino, how was that? 2 hours from here, an hour and a half from here, depending on traffic, right? Pete Aguilar, Democrat from San Bernardino, and I had the only bipartisan piece of legislation. If it would have come to the floor, it would have been passed, and if they would have brought it up in the Senate, it likely would have passed. It's still there. It can be brought up. Like, we can solve these problems, but it's going to require elected officials that want to inspire rather than fearmonger.
Right. Tell the story, and to build off of that, tell the story about you and your ride to D.C. with Beto.
Sure.
I think that's one of my favorite stories in the book.
So when I was in Congress, I represented a district that was 29 counties, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. It took 10.5 hours to drive from one corner of the district to the other at 80 miles an hour, which was the speed limit in most of the district. But I found out the hard way it wasn't the speed limit in all of the districts. And so Beto, there's a town called El Paso, and there's a county of El Paso. He represented the city of El Paso, I represented the county of El Paso. So we had worked together on a number of issues. He's in San Antonio. I invited him to San Antonio to talk to some of my veterans groups. He was the only Texan on the veterans committee at the time. We had 3 meetings. First meeting, his flight to DC gets canceled. And the second meeting, mine got canceled. And I'm a Southwest Airlines guy. So if Southwest Airlines is canceling a flight, that means it's real, because they fly into anything, right? And so Beto goes, let's drive. And I said, okay. Now, I found out later he never thought I was going to say okay. And so a 35-hour trip where we were in the car for 31 hours, we live streamed 29 hours of it. 29 million people watched us over those 29 hours on our socials, and we were literally on every news program in the United States of America over that time. And what was fascinating to me through this experience, and we debated everything. This was when the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act was being debated in Congress. We had a 6-hour debate on healthcare. Every issue imaginable we debated. We took everybody's calls, and when they had a question to feed, we debated. Look, we also did things like had a fight about pie versus cake, which was better, you know. He's a pie guy. I was like, you know, the most offensive thing he said, I was like, I'm a cake person. I love cake. And he's like, you've just never had a good piece of pie. And I was like, you're crazy. But the thing that I learned from this experience is what I saw in my district, because it was a 50-50 district. I was a black Republican representing a 71% Latino district. Nobody thought I could win. But the thing that I saw in that district, and the thing I saw from this road trip, was that way more unites us than divides us. But we often focus on those things that divide us rather than talking about those issues that actually unite us. And when we see the other side or the opposite party as you know, not more than just adversaries, we got to change that mentality. They're trying to improve their communities too. We just have a different way of getting there. So it was clear way more unites us than divides us, because we heard from people all over the country. And the second thing I learned, the American public wants us to disagree without being disagreeable. We should be able to have this competition of ideas, because the only way we're going to solve these challenges about the role of technology in society, how do we make sure that those that haven't benefited from the capitalist and democratic system, that they're going to be able to get the help that they need? What percentage of GDP should be going towards healthcare? What is our role in the rest of the world. The only way we're going to actually solve these problems in a way that ensures that our economy continues to be the most important economy in the world is with that competition of ideas, which requires two parties that are willing to recognize that the other side is not your enemy, but they're coming from a different perspective. And so that's what the road trip solidified in me. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And so that's where I think the country is ready for people that are ready to be inspired. We've become an exceptional nation, not because of what we've taken, but because of what we have given. We gave a helping hand after World War II to our allies to help them rebuild after the worst war in the history of the planet. We helped people 6,000 miles away rebuild after a natural disaster. But we've also given people an example of how to live your values. This concept that power is rooted in individuals, not in the government. Like, that is when we're at our best. Yes, we haven't always gotten it right. But that's why we're always talking about a more perfect union. We are in a perpetual struggle in order to achieve that. And when we're doing that by giving to people, that's when we're at our best. And that's the only way we're going to make sure that the rest of the century stays the American century, is if we remember some of these founding ideas.
And let me just follow up on you and Beto, because if I remember in the story, you both agreed, or both did not endorse the candidates that were running against each other. And I know it caused some problems, but to me that was an admirable choice.
Why are you bringing up old stuff, man? You know, no, I'm joking. You know, it was true, right? So he got criticized because he didn't denounce me. I got criticized because I didn't denounce him. And it was just like, because it's fascinating. Media, a lot of individuals think you have to agree with your own side 100% of the time, and you have to disagree with the other side 100% of the time. That doesn't make any sense. I always tell people, do you agree with your spouse 100% of the time?
I'm not touching that one.
Yeah.
No
all
way.
those laughs were from the married people that they're in agreement. Okay, let the record reflect there was a lot of laughter in the room. So that's just crazy to me, that we expect that kind of unified of thought. The diversity of thought is important, and yeah. So one of the aftermaths of that was we both got criticized, but it's like, hey, you know, we trusted each other. We didn't always agree. We actually disagreed on a whole lot of things, but yeah, we got criticized for that.
Yeah. Well, let me take you then to a very thorny question. Not that any of these are not, but North Korea has been accelerating their nuclear weapons program. What should the United States do? Should we try to denuclearize? How do we address that North Korea, which then has a tie to the China questions?
This is one area where we should be cooperating with China on. There are several issues where we could be cooperating and working with China, because ultimately, here's why China cares. They do not want 4 million refugees on their border. And that's what would happen. And so this is an opportunity that we work, we have the Chinese get involved, and ultimately, Kim Jong-un is interested in one thing. He wants to die fat, drunk, and happy.
He's already halfway there.
Yeah. And so for him, this is about staying in power, and ultimately the helping the South Koreans and the Japanese talk about and show the North Korean people how different things are. That's the way that you're going to see potential regime change. Or he comes to the conclusion, look, is there a way to do what I call the Idi Amin treatment? Most people know Idi Amin as this terrible warlord. He lived out his days in Saudi Arabia, like 18 years, 18, 20 years, right? So is there that kind of option for someone like Kim Jong-un, it'll be difficult to explore. But this is one area where we should say, hey, us and China, we're in lockstep, and that can go to a place where we improve our relationship. And let me make it clear, we're frenemies with China. And that both of us can exist. We're going to compete on some things, and we're going to cooperate on others. But Chinese government has to operate based on the rules that they agreed to. If you're going to be a member of the World Trade Organization, you got to adhere to some rules. And so making sure that we're ensuring that they're playing by those rules, because guess what? I'm going to put money on openness, entrepreneurship, freedom, any days of the week over authoritarianism, right? So I'm betting on our side any day, but we got to make sure they're playing by the rules.
Right, right. Well, let me take you, because this can tie to China, this can tie to North Korea. This is the concept of the human rights. Where should it be in sort of our cornerstones in terms of our foreign policy, or should it be? And I mean, this could take you to one of the topics you do discuss very detailed, and that's Saudi Arabia. Talk about, I'm not even sure I use the term frenemy with them. That one's very thorny, but it has all kinds of effects, and especially the story we just saw today about MIB, or whatever his name.
MBS.
Yelling at our representative. Right? Where do you see that? And I mean, that talk about this idea of human rights.
So that's about our values. So if we are not living up to our values and expecting our friends to live up to them, then you're going to have a difficult time, right? And so Saudi Arabia, we got to separate Saudi Arabia as a country, Saudi Arabia as a population, and MBS. There's a distinction, and it's getting even worse. I've met MBS a number of times. MBS has said things that I had never heard another Arab president, potentate, or king ever say. He talked about Islamic extremism being a civil war within Islam. You've never heard other people talk about that. Allowing women to drive, trying to recognize that, something ridiculous like a third of their population leaves the country on the weekends because there's nothing to do. And so that's why, they opened up movie theaters. Like the first movie they showed in Saudi Arabia where men and women can go was Black Panther, right? So there have been some things that he's doing to try to change society, but if he doesn't accept the rights of human rights, if he doesn't understand that human rights are valuable, and here's what you've always seen: any authoritarian government always ends the same way. Now, some it takes 2 years, some it takes 30 years. And we need to make sure that we're toughest on our friends. Look, I get criticized a lot because I criticize my own party. But guess what? You should hold your friends to the highest potential standard, right? Because they're your friends. There's people that you should be listening to. So human rights should be at the forefront of all the things that we do, because it goes back to we have to make decisions based on our values, and we should clearly articulate our values. And when you cut corners, that's when you ultimately get in trouble down the road.
Let me let you in with an upbeat story. And that was the one where you talked about dealing with the accident in the street. Yeah. To me, that was just sort of encapsulates sort of your approach to the world. And I'll let you finish with that one, because I think it's so valuable for people to understand.
Sure. So when you're going to meet someone and giving you secrets, you got to do a surveillance detection route, an SDR. And you're trying to detect whether the local government's version of the FBI is following you or not. And so I'm in a foreign country in a city I had never been in before. And I'm in a Toyota Tercel, small car. And I'm getting ready to turn down an alley, which I thought was going to be completely abandoned and was going to help me spot surveillance if I had it. I made a rookie error. I had cased the location in the morning, and I was using it in the afternoon. I turned down this alley, and it was like a parade. Thousands of people, pack animals. It was packed. I'm in my little Tercel driving about 4 miles an hour, and this woman walks in front of my car, and I roll over, I mash my brake, and I roll over her flip-flop, and I drag her foot across the concrete. Bust her toe wide open, blood's everywhere. She looks in the car, realizes I'm not from around there, and starts screaming bloody murder. Hundreds of people banging on my car, shaking my car. What's rule number 2 at the farm? Get off the X. That little Tercel wasn't going to be able to get me that far. It's too many people. I had a weapon, but not enough ammunition for this situation. So I did what they least expected. I unfold my 6'3" frame out of this car, and everybody was shocked, because one, I was like twice the size of everybody. And I knew some of the local language were not good enough for this situation. And so I said, while everybody was shocked that I got out of the car, I said, does anybody speak English? And this little guy, this young kid, parts the crowd, raises a finger in the air, and says, I speak the English. I said, sir, where's the closest hospital? He asked the crowd, it's a couple blocks away. He said, fetch me a rickshaw. A rickshaw is a scooter with like a little carriage, and that comes up, and I make a big display of taking some money out of my pocket, give it to the woman, and I say, take her to the hospital immediately. And so she gets in the rickshaw, my little translator gets in the rickshaw and they drive away. And the crowd starts clapping. They're patting me on the back. Some dude like helps shove me in my little car. The crowd of people part, and I drive away, and I look in the rearview mirror, and everybody's waving, right? And my heart is beating, right? Because I'm thinking my mother was about to get a phone call that no mother ever wants to get. And I tell this story at the beginning of the book in the first chapter, because to me, it's equivalent to where we are in our country right now. Elected officials are packed in this car. There's some people banging on the car. There's some people in the car that are oblivious to what's going on. There's some in the car that are stoking and making people more upset outside, right? But a simple show of compassion and warm-heartedness turned a mob who would get ready to drag me out of the car and beat me to death. And a simple show of that warm-heartedness changed it immediately, right? And I think that's what we need in this country right now is a willingness to show and understand that the plight of many of us are going through, and many people in the country are going to, a willingness instead of fearmonger is to inspire. And I think that's what's going to be able to get us off this X, this moment in time that we're in, because I truly believe our best days are ahead of us. We have become the greatest economy in the world. We are the envy of the rest of the world, right? And we've done that over 247 years. And I want to continue that for another 247 years. Oh, and by the way, at the same time, continue to uplift humanity. And so we can do it. There is a different way, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book.
Well, thank you so much for coming tonight, sharing your ideas with us. And my greatest hope is we'll continue to see you taking senior leadership roles in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Hang on tight. Yeah, I got to tell you, I was actually the thing I was biggest concerned about tonight was we had it, and they didn't even hit on it. I thought they were up there debating it all night, was Texas Tech and Texas A&M. I mean, that was, if you think USC and UCLA are big time, that's a whole different level down there. So I knew I'd win because there's an Aggie in the crowd. I think it's 3 straight, is it not? There we go. Okay, so again, I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. That was a great conversation. I think that I kept on thinking that this is another anecdote here, right? I talked to my girlfriend Shannon. We've lived together for some time now. And when we first moved in together 7 years ago, I said, oh, by the way, I don't have a TV. I haven't had one since Y2K. And when we go out, I'm always talking to her, and I literally tell her, I was like, there's some wild eyes over there. There's some wild eyes. And you know what I mean by wild eyes? They're on cable TV every night, and everybody's the enemy, not the adversary, right? And I think you guys nailed that. And I think it's important that we continue to invite people to this forum so they can come in. Don't just show up when you want to hear something you agree with, right? I mean, that's what this is all about, is having the opportunity to come in and maybe pick an idea of something you don't necessarily agree with. So again, want to thank you for coming out. Kyle, if you guys haven't had a chance to meet Professor Long yet, he's wonderful. Somehow he is also a coach in addition to everything he's doing over at Chapman, so I appreciate that. We do have a gift here that I would like to present you. So, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, thank you for coming out this evening. And a rumor is out there that we may hear more from you and about you in the future. If you guys haven't had a chance to read the Atlantic article, we kind of didn't touch it tonight, but they are making some predictions about future visits to certain states, etc. So, thank you. Appreciate it. Before we wrap it up this evening, we have something really special that we wanted to do. For those of you who were involved the last few years when we kind of transitioned to Zoom, Nora Valenzuela was our chair during that time. And I have to tell you, I look at her almost as like my big sister, and trust me, I'm a little pain in the butt to her, just like a little brother would be, or have been. But she really, over the course of 2 years, she kind of kept things going. She really did. She kept the team pulled together. Now as we begin to kind of get going again and start to do events again, it really is a lot of it has to do with her leadership over the last 2 years. So Nora, I'd like you to come up really quickly, and we'd like to present you something. This as well.
Good evening. Thank you. I'm honored and humbled to receive an award from my little brother, since I'm the big sister. Yes, at times he was pain in the butt, but that's the beauty of our organization. We disagree. We may disagree on things, and that's the beauty of being in a democratic society. You disagree, but ultimately, jointly, you do the right thing. And that's exactly what Jeff and I always do together. And I think that's where we made a great team. And the only reason I'm up here, because I had an awesome team. I had great mentors like Serge and Judge Gray, our past chairs who are here tonight. And I learned a lot from them, not because of their ages. I know you're a young man and you don't want to be talking about that, but they were my mentors, so I learned a lot. When I came to America and I couldn't speak English, and I went in high school, I had to memorize the speech. And if I stood in front of the class and said this speech and somebody opened the door, I would forget my speech, and I had to start all over again. So one day that actually happened. Somebody opened the door, they came into the class, I forgot my speech, and I had to start all over again. The kids started laughing at me. All the kids in the class laugh at me, because in their mind, if you didn't speak English, you're stupid. So they associated the language and communication with lack of intelligence at the time. Well, that day, I decided I was going to do two things. I was going to connect with people with my heart, because you don't need a language to connect with people with your heart. And I also decided that I'm never going to write a speech and memorize it, so in case if I forget it, everybody will be laughing at me. And a good man once told me, talk to everybody from your heart. So I'm talking to you from my heart today, and I really want you to know how important World Affairs Council nationwide is. With all the challenges our political system is going through, all the differences, all the political differences. And thank you, Congressman, for mentioning about creating a safe environment. We need to make it safe for each other to disagree. It's okay. Beautiful ideas come out of disagreement. And that's what World Affairs Council does. It provides a platform for nonpartisan people from different views, political system, to come and talk and educate us so we can learn more. I wish to thank all of you for joining us, and I wish to thank our board this year, the wonderful board members, Jeff probably will introduce them or talk about them. But I do wish to also welcome our new members. I had the honor of meeting a couple of new folks. I think the young lady sitting next to Rick and the gentleman sitting here with your friend. Welcome to our organization. Jeff, just so you know, I've already signed him up for a couple of committees. So you got a couple of volunteers waiting. Yes, that's my job, is signing up volunteers. So thank you so much. I love you, the organization, and I love for all of us to work together to bring a platform for communication and learning from each other. Have a wonderful, safe evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Okay, so like everybody knows, out in the lobby, he'll be sitting afterwards to sign books, chat with him for a second, and feel free to do that. Upcoming events, first off, next week. Good luck to you guys. Kick some butt, make us feel proud of we're already proud of you, but bring home the trophy. We'd love to have you back. Exactly, the winning team's actually going to Qatar this year. So just real quick, 2 upcoming events. I kind of hit on them earlier. One is on May 17th. Admiral Davidson, the former commander of the Indo-Pacific, just recently retired, will be coming in on that Tuesday. Definitely encourage you to come out, bring some friends, and get that energy going again. The other thing is we have an event that takes place every fall that I strongly encourage. I know there's a few people who have been to it in the past. Every year in DC, we have a national conference. And if you haven't had a chance to go out to it, I know Nora's been there, and Serge has been there. I've been there a few times. Don's been there. It really is a spectacular 3 or 4 days. Why? I mean, you get to go into think tanks, you get to go into embassies, you get to sit down with people, and I see a few others that are nodding their heads right now. I've gone for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's always a highlight for me. We really would love to have a big team come out this year from the local council in mid-November, 15th through the 18th. It's open now in terms of registration. So if you haven't thought about the past, it's definitely something to think about in the future, and it certainly is worth your time. So again, thank you everybody for coming out this evening. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your contributions to the council, and it helps us keep going, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Take care. Make sure the sucker's off.